Hello, this is Court Watch with Alex Swoyer, and I'm excited to bring you the latest episode of my podcast, where I am joined by Dr. Adam Feldman, Supreme Court scholar and statistics keeper with Legalytics. He is joining me in just a moment to highlight the term's biggest statistical takeaways from the justices. Thank you so much for taking time to speak with me and break down some of the highlights of this term for our audience. One of the things you and I always talk about, I feel like every July, is kind of a read of where the justices, align, don't align, any particular things that you thought, were spectacular about the term. So I know you've done this for many years. You might be able to tell me how many terms you've been keeping stats. But one of the questions I wanted to start with was, what did you think from this year compared to the past? Was there anything in particular that stood out to you?
A few things, definitely. There was a lot of cases, many of them dealt with politics, dealt with Trump, the executive branch, presidential power. And unlike in previous terms, it didn't go 100% in Trump's direction. So the justices showed that there were some policies they were willing to uphold, some they were willing to overturn. We also saw some close cases where the conservative justices weren't all in the majority. And some of these are really big cases. We've seen in the past where the conservative justices aren't always in the majority in close cases, but usually these aren't the hot button cases. And for at least several of them this term, it was really a mix of justices with some of the conservative and liberal justices, both in the majority and in dissent.
Let me ask you, one of the things we kind of talk about, like when a justice comes on the court, they're new, it kind of takes maybe a few terms to kind of see exactly maybe where they're going to fall or who they're going to align with the most. Kavanaugh and Justice Kavanaugh and Chief Justice Roberts seemed to be in the middle a lot, and then enter Justice Amy Coney Barrett. She kind of seems to be there too. Who do you think is the middle of the road? I mean, is there is there someone you can pinpoint? Is it Roberts?
Yeah, so I think Roberts tries to be that center of the court. He's the one who kind of actively tries, and he has an incentive that most other of the rest of the justices don't, which is that when he's in the majority, he gets to assign who writes the opinion. And for big cases, he oftentimes takes that for himself. One example of that is Trump versus Barbara this term. And he's done that very often in previous terms. Now, Kavanaugh and Barrett oftentimes are the second and third most frequent justices in the majority, and so that trio really makes up the center of the court. But I think in terms of the center of power, the gravity really goes towards Roberts more than the other two justices that are in the middle there.
Yeah. One of the things I thought too was interesting is I think last time you and I spoke about last term, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, she was the one who spoke the most words during oral arguments. Is that still the case?
Yeah, she, without question, speaks the most across the term. She has since she joined the court in 2022. She did again this term. She definitely picks certain cases where she has a lot more to say. Oftentimes, it's going through kind of lengthy expositions about history or things that she finds relevant. Sometimes it goes towards questions, but oftentimes it's really trying to explain a narrative, and that leads to really, really long speaking turns that the other justices don't tend to take. The last justice that really did something like that was her predecessor, Justice Breyer.
What when we see her do this, what type of cases do they usually tend to be? Is there a certain type of legal question or area of law?
Yeah, they tend to be issues surrounding individual rights. And so civil rights is a big part of that. If there is something about the question of oppression, or a group that is arguing that they are given unequal treatment, these equal protection type of claims, those are the ones that she tends to speak the most in. We saw that in some of the immigration cases this term.
Hmm. I think I guess the civil liberties, civil rights would be a lot. I've covered her since she was on the court with I remember the affirmative action. She was very interested. It was interesting to hear her and then kind of read Justice Thomas kind of compare and contrast the two on race issues. And I also think of the voting rights case this term, for
Mhm.
example. Who writes the most?
Well,
Is it
if we look at overall opinion count, it tends to be Justice Thomas, because he writes the most separate opinions each term, almost consistently. Yeah, for the last decade, he wrote the most concurrences this term, and that's where he really got his numbers up. Justice Jackson wrote the most dissents this term. So the justices split pretty evenly across majority opinions. That's pretty much a norm of practice. So it's really where we get the most opinions. It tends to be through separate opinions.
Do we take anything from that? Like, who talks the most, who writes the most? Like, what type of information does that kind of give you?
So it's really interesting when we think about it because neither of those really play into the law that the Supreme Court sets or interprets. It doesn't actually set law. So oral arguments, you're getting points in, trying to ask questions, clarify policy, or whatever objectives justices have. But ultimately, that doesn't mean that they're going to write the opinion or even have a lot of input in the opinion. And sometimes we see justices speak hardly at all or not at all and then write the opinions of the court. We saw that with Justice Thomas for numerous years, where he didn't really raise anything during oral arguments. Same thing goes for concurrences and dissents. These don't set law. They give certain points. They tell what the justices think that the law should be or how it should be interpreted and read, but they don't actually set the law. So it's interesting. And since the justices don't actually have to write any separate opinions, we see Roberts almost every term write few, if any, separate opinions at all, including this term where he wrote zero separate opinions. They don't have to do that. It's not part of their job. So when they're doing it, they're choosing to, for whatever reason, that they think that the interpretation of the law should be different than that of the majority.
Is there a way, statistically to be able to, I guess, like, definitively say, Justice Thomas is the justice furthest to the right? I guess from covering the court, I would say that's probably how it is. Him and Alito probably give each other a run for their money, but, like, I just seems like Justice Thomas might be the furthest on the right. And then on the left, I've often wondered, is there any stat that shows, where does Justice, Jackson sit compared to Justice Sotomayor? I know we have talked in the past, you and I, about Kagan kind of being in the middle with Kavanaugh and Chief Justice Roberts. That was a few terms ago. It now seems like more, now that Barrett's on the court, she's kind of slipped in the middle there. Um, is there a way to tell, like, who's on the furthest on the right, who's the furthest on the left, so to say?
Yeah, it's a tricky question because really part of that it boils down to how you define what the right and left mean. Do you mean it in political terms? Do you mean it by like policy preferences? So there's a lot of debate within the scholarly community of what it really means to be on the right or the left of the court,
Right.
because it doesn't mean the same as for like a legislator or a president, where you actually have incentive for voters to side with a clear base. But there are within the legal academic community, there have been attempts to do this. Usually, it means kind of choosing what that left and right means and trying to figure out which justice means that or is closest to that definition, and then find who is the closest to the left justice to the right justice. There's a score that's been used within political science called the Martin Quinn scores that essentially do this, and they've done it since they have the records back to the 30s. So what's interesting there is they actually track justices across time along with within a court. So you can say
That's
that a
interesting. Yeah.
justice, yeah. So the people do that, but there is no kind of definitive way to say it.
Is there, so, like, I guess based on that metric, have they defined, I mean, since you said it's been going on for decades, like, is that, like, clearly where they put Thomas? Like, do
Yeah,
we know
so
kind of?
so Thomas and Alito, I mean, they're almost at the same point on the right. You see Jackson, I think, is just about the furthest to the left, then Sotomayor, and then Kagan, with the three justices in the middle. So it does kind of split that way. Gorsuch is also kind of not as far to the right as Thomas and Alito, but further than Kavanaugh, Barrett, and Roberts.
Right. Let me ask you, in terms of talking about ideologies and stuff, everyone talks about 6-3 splits. How were the ideological splits this term in comparison to last? Were there more? Were there less? Um, what was your takeaway there?
It was interesting because there was definitely an uptick in 6-3 splits this term. When you look at just on the percentage basis, there were more than in the past term. There were more than the average since Barrett joined the court in 2020. There were also, of those 6-3 splits, there were more of those that were along ideological lines than in past terms. And so you had a large percent of the cases that were along there were ideological splits. But that said, some of the biggest cases, I would say, two of the biggest cases came down where it was an ideological split. So one was learning resources,
Right.
the tariff
Tariffs.
case, where it was 6-3, but it wasn't along ideological lines. And then Trump versus Barbara was 5-4, and definitely was not along ideological lines either.
Yeah.
So you have big cases like like the gerrymandering case, the redistricting case of this term, where it was a 6-3 split. You have the transgender sports cases, which was 6-3 split, which was something that I and many people that kind of do this prediction work with the court said it was going to be along those lines all along. So some are predictable, but it was really like an interesting smattering this term.
When we talked about the big cases, I felt like a lot of the rulings were kind of predictable, especially after oral arguments. Was there anything that surprised you or anything in the stats this term that you think is noteworthy that I didn't ask you about that I should have?
Yeah. So I guess when we think about like the big cases, it was interesting, it was somewhat predictable that the justices would go in different directions in Slaughter and Cook. So the two Trump appointment or the two Trump removal cases where the Fed chair was treated differently than the FTC. And so somewhat predictable, but also interesting that they were both agencies and the court went in different directions. I think that there were some kind of surprises, some interesting splits. The 5-4 in Barbara, I thought it was going to be kind of further apart. When I looked at it earlier, I said it was likely to be 7-2 or 6-3, say in the same direction. But you had kind of interesting posturing. I think a lot of the other big cases were pretty predictable how they came down. There were some that were interesting. There were kind of close to call in advance. One that I was looking at was Monsanto versus Durnell, the Roundup case,
Mhm.
and that was really hard to call. And so some of them, just didn't break down clearly along the lines I think that were expected. But I would say for the ones that people were following the closest, they were predictable almost entirely.
Okay,
One
interesting.
other thing, just
Yeah.
to raise, yeah, you were saying other things also. Just the level of unanimity, because I think that gets discussed, but maybe not enough. It was just about average for the last number of terms this term, which is around 42%. When we think about 42% of the cases the justices are agreeing upon together, that's a pretty high rate of consensus. And so when there's such a focus on how the justices break down along ideological lines, I think that point needs to be brought up, as well. And then it really comes down to whether we weight court cases that we see as more important as maybe being more worthy to focus on, or if we look at the whole term as each case individually matters. Then it's almost getting close to 50% of the cases where the justices agree 9-0.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's noteworthy that it's kind of stayed around, I think you said like 42%
Hmm.
for the
Yeah.
unanimous rulings, but that we also did have an uptick in the ideological splits. But I guess that could also just be like there were quite a few you could say like high stakes cases this term. I think at one point I did a little listicle story and there was like a dozen that we were keeping tabs on. Um, but anything else that before I let you go that you wanna correct out there that you might see, misinformation about? One thing I thought maybe I'd ping you on, I don't know if you know off the top of your head, but there's been some, like, chatter if there's gonna be a request to rehear birthright. I mean, how rare would something like that be?
Yeah, I mean they do that every few terms where they'll either have a rehearing or they'll revisit a case. So it's not out, it wouldn't be out of nowhere. I mean, we even saw with Trump versus Casa, the national injunction case the nationwide injunction case that they essentially heard that in two parts. So
Right.
we do see that. And so we see it, occasionally. We saw the redistricting case from this term was
True.
re-argued. So it's unusual, but it's not super unusual. It does
I
it does
suppose
happen.
Yeah, I suppose it would be unusual compared to, like, the, redistricting case just because we didn't get a ruling in that one, right?
Yeah.
Like, they decided to go ahead and rehear it, and here you actually kinda have, like, a final say,
Yeah.
but of course, it would be interesting to cover.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, I'd be following
Yeah.
it as well.
Well, thank you so much for your time, I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to the latest episode of Court Watch. If you have not subscribed yet to this podcast, please do so, and also feel free to email me interesting questions or topics that you want explored about the legal reporting world. I'll do my best to answer them during each episode. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to hearing from you all soon. Listen to my podcast, Court Watch, at WashingtonTimes.com or wherever you get your favorite podcasts.